Professor Heschel, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to Institute for Hebrew Language and Literature and also to New Book Network. It is a great honor to speak with you about your academic work, your new book, The Woman Question in Jewish Studies, and of course about your future projects. Can you please introduce yourself for our viewers? Who
Yes,
are
of
you?
course. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you. So my name is Susannah Heschel. I hold the Eli M. Black Chair in Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College in the United States. It's a university, but we're 250 years old, so we use the name college. It's in Hanover, New Hampshire, which is north of Boston, on the way to Canada. And we have a very strong program in many fields, including in the humanities and also in Jewish studies and religious studies. My background is that I grew up in New York City. I studied for my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. I taught for 3 years in Dallas, Texas, at Southern Methodist University. And then for 6 years at Case Western Reserve University. I had a year at the National Humanities Center, and then I came to Dartmouth. And I've also taught as a visiting professor at several institutions, including the University of Cape Town, Edinburgh, Frankfurt. This past year, I was a visiting professor at Harvard University. I've also taught at Princeton. And I spent a year in Berlin at the Wissenschaftskolleg. So I have had the pleasure of getting to know people in my field in different parts of the world. And it's good to be with you in Belgrade via
Thank
Zoom.
you. Thank you. Your work covers Jewish history, biblical scholarship, anti-Semitism, religion, and gender. What main idea connects those different areas of your research?
Well, that's a great question. And I'll tell you that my interest began when I fell in love with the Bible when I was a child. And I thought that I would specialize in graduate school in Hebrew Bible. But the problem I had was with biblical scholarship. I felt that the scholars of the Bible, who were dominatingly Protestant from Germany from the 19th century, were asking the wrong questions. And a lot of Jewish scholarship was responding to the Protestant scholarship in a somewhat defensive or apologetic manner. I think, for example, Yecheskel Kaufman, it's important, but I didn't like the way the field had taken shape. And so I started to think about what created the field of biblical studies. How did it come into being in the 19th century? What were the influences politically, culturally, linguistically, and so forth? And in the course of that interest, I started to study the work first of Leo Beck for a seminar that I took when I was a graduate student with Ismar Schorsch. And then I became very interested in Beck and his work, his responses to Protestant scholarship. But as I went back in time, I found that really the figure who was original in this field was Abraham Geiger. So Geiger was born in 1810 in Frankfurt, and his first book, which was his doctoral dissertation published in 1833, was a study of the Quran and parallels between rabbinic literature and the Quran. It was an important book that was praised all over Europe and is credited to this day with launching the field of Islamic studies. He went on later in his career, he worked as a rabbi in Germany, and he was one of the leaders of liberal Judaism at the time. But in later years, he also wrote a very important book on Second Temple Judaism and the different factions within that period. It's a big, thick book. And based on his studies of the different factions within Judaism, he also wrote some very long and important articles about early Christianity and where we should contextualize the New Testament, the Gospels, the figure of Jesus, and so forth. He died in 1874. What I discovered was that his work was widely read and discussed by Protestant scholars, a few Catholics, within Europe, in Germany, in France, the Netherlands, Britain. And his work was reviewed. It was usually criticized, sometimes praised, as is always the case in academic scholarship, but it made an impact. And his arguments were clear and in many ways devastating for liberal Protestant theology, because he said basically that Jesus said nothing new, nothing original. Now, what I want to emphasize here, a couple of points. First of all, by arguing that if you look at Jesus in the context of Second Temple Judaism, you see that everything he said was what the other rabbis were also saying. There's nothing new, nothing original. Then the question would be, well, then why should Christians follow Jesus or look for the faith of Jesus if Jesus's faith is Judaism? For Geiger, it was a liberal form of Judaism, a liberalizing form of Judaism that he identified with the Pharisees, and that he said continued in early rabbinic literature, but eventually was, in some sense, squelched. That is, the liberalism became narrow and ghettoized under centuries of persecution by Christians, and rabbinic law lost its initial impulse of liberalization. But essentially what Geiger was suggesting is that if you want to be a Christian and have the faith of Jesus, where are you going to find it today? You would find it in liberal Judaism. Now, there are other elements here too, and one of those, and here I want to connect this with feminist theory. So while I was writing this book, feminist theory in the academic world was at its height. Lots of interesting new analyses and ideas, especially in the field of literature. And what struck me about that were arguments that came up in a very important book called The Mad Woman in the Attic by Gilbert and Gubar. It's a study of the 19th century British novel. And the question is, what do women writers, like the Bronte sisters or Jane Austen, what do women writers do with the plot of the novel? Because the novel is always about a boy meets girl, do they get married, not married, and so forth. But when women start writing about this plot, they do it in a different way. And I started to think about Jewish scholars in the 19th century who were in a similar kind of position vis-a-vis Christian theologians. That is, just as women had to deal with patriarchal hegemony, Jews, especially Jewish scholars in Germany, where there was a very busy, active world of scholarship, Jews had to cope with Christian hegemony that dominated the universities, that edited the journals in which a Jew could not publish an article, and so forth. So feminist theory helped me understand the politics of Jewish scholarship in a new way. Post-colonial theory is an example of it, but really it was my study of feminist theory that helped me see the position of Jewish scholars, how difficult it was in so many respects, institutionally, but intellectually as well. So that's the connection between these two different aspects of my work. And of course, you can't write about 19th century Jewish thought without thinking about anti-Semitism, just as you can't write about women without thinking about sexism, misogyny, and so forth. So that came up as an issue for me as well. And then finally, I'll just mention that one of the responses of Protestant scholars to Geiger's argument, which said basically, there's nothing new in Jesus. All of his teachings come out of Judaism. One of the responses was to say, yes, it's true that what Jesus said is not new. But then they turned to racial theory, which in the late 19th century was very popular and viewed as something sophisticated and modern. And they said, well, Jesus was still different racially. That is, he may have repeated certain Jewish teachings, but racially he was not a Jew, he was an Aryan. He comes from the Galilee, and the Galilee had been laid waste by the Assyrians in the 8th century BCE, and it was filled with a population that came from other areas, a population of Aryans. So that's an argument that I then followed in my book called The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians in the Bible in Nazi Germany, which was a study based on archives of Protestant theologians who sought to remove everything Jewish from Christianity. They got rid of the Old Testament, Jesus was an Aryan, all of these things. But I want to mention one other element, final point. When Geiger writes about the parallels between the Quran and Rabbinic Judaism in his first book in 1833. He really launched a tradition of Jewish scholarship that continued for the next century in Germany, of Jewish scholars looking for these parallels and actually being very interested in the origins of Islam and seeing the Jewishness of the Quran, the Jewish teachings, rabbinic teachings. But he also was part of a tradition of Jews finding parallels between the New Testament and rabbinic teachings. But I see an important distinction here in these two efforts. When Geiger and Beck and so many others write about Judaism and Christianity, their argument is, well, Jesus said nothing new. There's nothing new here, nothing original. When they write about Islam or about the Quran in particular, what they say is something different. They're saying, look at the amazing influence that Judaism has had on the world. Look how Judaism in Arabia influenced the figure of Muhammad and early Islam. So these are two very different approaches that are taken by Jewish thinkers in their scholarship. And that I find very interesting.
I understand. Okay. How did you and Sarah Imhoff decide to write a woman question in Jewish studies, and why did you choose this title?
So this book was sparked by the publication of a different book. I believe it was the year 2018. There was a book called Hasidism, A New History that was published, also by Princeton University Press. The book is 850 pages, big, thick book, and it was written by 8 men. Most of the men were either retired or about to retire, and then there were a couple of younger postdocs who were involved. This was a big project. They received a lot of funding for this project, and they met every summer for 2 months, I believe always at Leipzig at the Dubnov Institute, to work on this project. So it was many years in the making, and it had the potential for being quite exciting, a new history of Hasidism. When the book came out, Sarah and I were both appalled that these 8 men had written a book without ever inviting one of the women scholars in the field of Hasidism to participate. One of them, who has since passed away, Ada Rappaport Alpert, wrote to me that she was really upset. She's a great scholar. She was invited to come and talk to these men, but she was not part of the project from its onset. And there were many others. There's another scholar named Sippi Kaufman, also a great scholar of Hasidism, an Israeli, who should have been invited, who's very innovative in her scholarship and smart, and she was not included, and she has since died. So it's tragic. And there's several other women I could also name. At any rate, I was very upset, and I got in touch with Sarah and suggested that the two of us write a review of this book. It's not only that women weren't included. I would add to this. There is a field called religious studies, a study of religion, and no one from that field was involved in this project or consulted, or there's no sign of any influence that these 8 men had even read a book in that field to think about how does one write about religion. The book about Hasidism says nothing, for example, about the Hasidic story. That's such a central genre of Hasidism, and yet it's ignored completely in these 850 pages. In addition, there's nothing in the book about prayer. Prayer is central in Hasidism. There's nothing there. And then, of course, there's nothing about women other than one passage that says, well, women really aren't part of Hasidism. And another passage about the contemporary period, which describes some of the clothing, modest clothing that Hasidic women wear. That's it. That's really not acceptable. It might have been acceptable 100 years ago, but not today. And in general, the presentation of Hasidism in the book is really not new. It's the same old that we've been hearing about Hasidism since the turn of the century. Is a certain quality of this is a weird movement, Hasidism, that it's not enlightened, and it's not, all of this is not appropriate. We want to understand why Hasidism has been growing enormously. Why? Why is it so appealing to people? What is the draw? What is the life? What is the experience of being Hasidic? Today, in the past, what can we learn from this? That book doesn't raise these questions. So these were our criticisms. And then we decided, actually, I then went to the another journal, and I saw our review appeared in the forward. I went with my colleague Shaul Magid, and we gathered about 10 different reviews by scholars of Hasidism who pointed out all the flaws in the book. And then I told Sarah, we should really expand this, because it's not only this one book. There's so many books, other books, edited volumes that have no women participants, editorial boards of journals with no women, and so on. And all of the things that we ourselves have experienced as women in the field, moments where we've been patronized and denigrated and harassed. That's not right. So we started talking to our colleagues, and they told us, how they were treated in graduate school or as junior faculty and even as senior faculty. And there aren't that many women senior faculty. And we also were concerned that, unless you mentor a young student, a graduate student, the student can't flourish. Students need conversations. All of us do. More than that, I want to hear from younger people. When I hear from a graduate student what they're thinking, I see new approaches, new ideas. There's something very important about youth. People have a new approach and a different perspective. I want to hear that. We need that. And we need to hear not only from young people, from mid-career people. I want to hear from women, from men, from non-binary people, from people who have different kinds of experiences of life. People who are gay, people who are straight, people who are religious, people who are not religious, people who grew up religious and then stopped being religious, people who grew up secular, became religious. All of these experiences of Judaism are very important, and including people who are not Jewish, who bring their own experience and insight. I remember hearing about this from professors of mine, that sometimes a Christian student who had never read Midrash but knew Hebrew came to class and had such great ideas. That's important too. So that's how we started on this book.
Okay, the book also examines the 19th century origins of Jewish studies, which old ideas about gender and scholarship are still present today.
Yes, so we're very interested. After all, I wrote about Geiger, wrote about that period. Abraham Geiger went to study at university, first at Heidelberg, then Bonn, 1830, at a time when Jewish men were just beginning to be admitted to German universities. And keep in mind, Germany had the greatest number of universities of any European country. So Jewish men began to study, a few of them, not everywhere, and they were not always welcomed, as we know. But women in general, Jewish or not, couldn't go to university until the end of the century. And then in some cases, there were women who simply wanted to listen to a lecture given by a professor. They had to ask permission, and sometimes it was denied. So university education was limited. This has an effect on an entire society. If we think about this, what happens when a man goes to university and gets a PhD, becomes a scholar, thinks like a scholar, trained, let's say, as a historian or a lawyer or a doctor, and then marries a woman who's never had an education? What does it do to their relationship? What does that relationship between them then do to the children who are raised? What kind of home are they creating where the man knows a lot and the woman hasn't had that kind of training? So this is a much wider societal issue, first of all. But then I also started to think about what it means when a scholar such as Heinrich von Treitschke, who was a famous historian in Berlin in the second half of the 19th century, would not allow women to attend his lectures, and who also published a horrific anti-Semitic tract in 1879. Now, what's the connection there? Is there a connection? We have to think about that. I've read a lot about Treitschke and his anti-Semitism and other anti-Semites who hated Jews. Fine. But no one's ever discussed the fact that Željko, the anti-Semite, also wouldn't let women come to his lectures. Is there a connection there? What does it say about his mentality, about the kind of society he kept, his own social environment, etc.? So that's another issue. And then, of course, what happens to Jewish scholarship in general? How Jews are kept out of the journals, out of the university. There's no such thing as Jewish studies. And yet, if you wanted to learn something about Judaism at a German university, the one place you would do it would be in the Faculty of Protestant Theology, where they might talk about Second Temple period, about the Hebrew Bible, which they called Old Testament, and so on. And it would be a pretty negative depiction of Judaism in those faculties. So we also wanted to understand what has carried over for us, even in the understanding of what it is to be a scholar. What do scholars do? We go, for example, to archives. Well, Leopold von Ranke describes, and it's in our book, describes going to an archive as visiting, it's like visiting Italian women who want to be penetrated by him. Yeah, there's an image through the metaphor of what it is to study, which is to penetrate something, and it has sexual overtones. Then what does that do also for the traditions that we bring even to the present day? My husband is a geologist.
Oh.
And my husband used to tell his students he would pick up a rock and he would say, "Rock, tell me how old you are." So that's very different from trying to penetrate something, take control of something. So what is our relationship as scholars with the material we study? That's the question. And how is that gendered? And where does that leave women? Those are some of the questions we ask in our book.
I understand. One more question connected with your book, The Woman Question in Jewish Studies. What practical changes are most urgently needed in universities, journals, conferences, hiring, mentoring, and citation practices?
What should we be doing? Is that what you're asking?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we need to be paying attention, first of all. So when we organize a conference, or we want to edit a book or a journal, a collection, and we see that we have 10 men and no women, what should we do? Well, one thing to do is to simply contact a woman colleague and say, I'm organizing a conference on this topic. Are there any women who work in this field? That would be something to do. I think it's important when we have a conference or when we have, let's say, a panel at a national meeting, that if there are only men, women graduate students might feel not as welcome as they should be. We want to make sure that people who are smart and talented enter our field, and we don't want to put obstacles in the way. Obstacles that can also be sometimes very subtle or implicit, send an implicit message. You're not really welcome here. This is really a men's community and we don't want women, something like that, without saying it. Sometimes women pick up on it and don't feel comfortable, for example, raising their hand, asking a question, engaging with the work. And that's not good for the field and it's not good for women. That's a problem. So I would say pay attention, first of all. Think about what you're doing. And that would be true also in the classes we teach. I remember once as a student in a graduate seminar, we were reading Glickel's memoir. And there's one passage where she talks about her first husband on his deathbed. And she writes in her memoir that she asked him, "May I embrace you?" And he said, "Have you been to the mikveh?" And she said, "No." And he said, "Then don't embrace me." And I called attention to that passage and said, what do we learn from this? What is it saying about mikveh, about death? And why does she even put this in her memoir? It's painful. It's a painful moment. Why does she, in some sense, conclude her story of her marriage with such a painful passage where he's rejecting her embrace. Let's think about that. And my professor was a man said, no, that's not important. Let's not talk about it. I was stunned. I think it's important. I think it tells us a lot that a woman would put this in her memoir, but he changed the subject. So we need to think about that as well. Sometimes the question a student asks may not be my question, but I have to be attentive because maybe the student has a good point to make that I haven't thought of. And that takes a certain, let's say, a certain humility on the part of the professor to be willing to say, let me hear what you have to say, and let me put myself aside for a moment.
Yeah. What is your future projects? About what you work now?
Well, I actually just this week finished an article about Jewish refugee scholars who came to the United States in the
Oh.
1930s. And that was interesting to me to see what contributions they made, not only to the world of academia, because they entered American universities that really had very few Jewish professors, very few. Yale had one, Paul Weiss in the philosophy department, Yale College. So what was it like for them to come into this kind of an environment? And what's striking to me is how many of these scholars went to what we call HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, where they were welcomed and where they got involved in the civil rights movement, many of them, where they saw the anti-Black racism. And of course, they understood its significance coming from Nazi Germany. It's also interesting to me to see how these Jewish scholars created the sense in America that Jews are smart, that Jews are scholarly, that scholarship and Jewishness go together somehow. And we had what emerged after World War II was what has been called a golden age of American Jewish life. There was a wonderful flourishing of Jewish scholarship. Jewish studies was established at universities, Jewish intellectuals, there were the famous New York Jewish intellectuals and so on. This was a moment, and these refugee scholars helped create it. And I would just add to that that I grew up in the home of a refugee scholar, so I have lots of memories of what it was like for these people who had studied at German universities and who sat at the Shabbat dinner table and talked about their professors, sometimes with horror that this or that professor had become a Nazi. It was unbelievable. The book that everyone was talking about in those days was a book that was written just after the war by Max Weinreich called Hitler's Professors. And he was able to write this book based on archives at the YIVO in New York, which had captured some documents from the Ministry of Propaganda in Nazi Germany. So this was also a time where these incredibly well-trained German Jewish scholars came to America, sometimes bringing a Nobel Prize with them, sometimes coming and then winning a Nobel Prize. It was an incredible flourishing. And for them, of course, America was a strange country. They were still immersed in European culture. They talked about Goethe and Schiller and Thomas Mann. They didn't read Hawthorne and Moby Dick by, or any of the other American writers.
Yeah.
So this was a different environment for them to enter.
Yeah. In this period, do you see anti-Semitism growing up also in America, United States, also in Europe, also in all the world? And what you think about this? Why? Of
Yes,
course, because
today,
the war, okay, but in last, I think, 2 or 3 years, anti-Semitism is growing up extremely. What do you think about this? Why? Do you have some idea?
am I'm not sure I or anyone really fully understands what has happened and why. we do see that it's coming from the right, coming from the left, that it's coming from all directions, and that it seems to be everywhere, ubiquitous. And that's very shocking because in the past, waves of anti-Semitism have generally been limited to a certain region. So in Europe, let's say in France after the Dreyfus affair, that sort of thing. But this is worldwide, and that's something very new. What interests me about it, or what I pay attention to, is not only what is said, but how it's said, the kinds of language and the tone of voice, the rage that's used to express. And I would say, as an example, on October 8th, there was a rally in New York City, and a professor from Cornell University, Russell Rickford, said that he felt exhilarated. And that was very horrifying and striking to me. And I heard that word exhilarated several times. What does it mean to feel exhilarated when 1,200 people have just been murdered? So that to me was really, it was a horrifying moment. The celebration of the Hamas murders. So in that sense, I think this anti-Semitism began before October 7th, that October 7th became for anti-Semites an excuse to express their anti-Semitism. But it didn't just happen overnight. There were seeds already planted for a long time. And then the question is, what gives rise to this? And what is the mood also? To me, it's a combination of a mood of rage on the one hand, and then using the Hamas murders of October 7th to express not rage at Hamas, but rage at Israel and rage at Jews. So how did that mechanism come into play? And where does it begin? What plays into it? What creates it? So that it was in some sense like a boiling pot before October 7th. I would just add to this that at my university, we have had a very good relationship between Jewish studies and Islam and Middle Eastern studies, the two departments. We worked together for years, co-sponsoring lectures and workshops and seminars and teaching courses together. I was teaching that fall a course with my colleague Jonathan Smolin on the 1967 Arab-Israeli War and its aftermath. So as soon as this happened, I called three of my colleagues and we convened two public forums at Dartmouth on Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, open to the entire campus. And I would say it was 90% students who came to answer questions, to talk to them, and to demonstrate that we have faculty with expertise whom they could consult. But also to make one very important point, and that is the way we talk at a university is different from the way we talk at a restaurant, in a private home, and so forth. We speak in a certain way at a university. We speak with respect and with dignity. There has to be a dignity to our academic discourse. That's the bottom line. And that's something precious because I told our student, we're not going to find that elsewhere. When you're a student for 4 years at a university, you have a very special experience. Take advantage of it, learn from it, carry it with you. I'm well aware other universities did not have that kind of relationship. They hadn't developed it over the years, and they couldn't come together. And that's really too bad. Very sad for me. And many colleges contacted us and said, what should we do? Give us advice. They could have done what we had done. I don't know why it didn't occur to them to do that. But that's what one should do. You come together in dialogue and in a spirit of dignity and respect. So I may, and I do, disagree with some things from my colleagues, but I teach our students also, the question isn't to have an argument in class or to make a proclamation, this is what I think should happen. We're here to learn and we want to think critically. So when someone makes a claim in a book, in an article, in a class, think about what is the basis for this claim? and think about it critically. Do you have enough warrants to support the claim you're making? What does it rest on? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses of the argument? That's what you should look for. It's not a question of fighting about the claim, but let's dissect it and see if it's a legitimate claim, see if it makes sense. So that's our approach, and that's what we do in our classroom. And I would like to see that as the approach at all academic institutions.
Okay. As a member of the editorial board of the European Hebrew Journal, what do you think about this international Diamond Open Access project, and what kinds of articles would you like to see, and what is your message to scholars who may wish to submit their work?
Well, I think it's a very exciting moment whenever there is a new journal in the field. And I would hope that people will realize that having something new also gives you an opportunity to say something new. I would hope that scholars will submit work that they've done on a particular topic and think about it, think about the topic in a new way. Experiment perhaps with a new interpretation or a new way of contextualizing the data. Um, think about how our work in the field of Jewish studies has something to contribute to people in other fields. That's important too. What do we have to say to the discourse of the academy? What contribution do we make? And that's something I think is very important. It was important to me when I was in graduate school in the 1980s that there was a lot of excitement about thinking about Jewish experience and learning from it. Just as, for example, I learned from feminist theory how to think about 19th century Wissenschaft des Judentums, Abraham Geiger. I think we can learn from the experience that Jews have had something about what Asian Americans experience, what Black Americans experience, what minorities experience in different contexts. We also can learn certain methods of thinking. I just started the book, The Wandering Jew by Yair Minsker, for example. And I love the approach that he takes. What does it mean when Jews are called wandering? And that label, which can at times be highly anti-Semitic, can then be adopted in certain cases by a Jew, made into a Jewish self-label, self-designation, with the anti-Semitism removed from it and becomes something very different. That, I think, is a fascinating question. Can we take an anti-Semitic label and transform it in some way, take the sting out of it, one might say? Yeah? So I would hope that contributions will come to the journal from scholars who are thinking in new ways and have conversations that are ongoing, intellectual conversations with other fields and with colleagues. I also hope that this journal will be international in terms of its readership and also its contributors. So we will have scholars from different parts of the world writing articles, and that in itself can be very interesting. What are we learning from scholars, for example, in China? There is Jewish studies in China. What can we learn from their point of view about classical Jewish texts, for example? So this is what I would hope this journal will contribute.
Yes, Toda Lael means thanks God. We have submitted manuscripts from all the world. And what you think? Do we have now in this moment? This is new journal, okay? From idea to realization. We work just maybe 6 or 7 months. So, do you think is important project, or do you think this is new, okay? This is new project, but do we need something like this? Do you see the scope of the journal? Maybe what you think about the scope?
Well, in general, I'm someone who likes a big scope. I think that the journal will be exciting to people in many different disciplines within Jewish studies. And the fact that it is coming from Europe is also important. And the fact that it's taking contributions from around the world. So I think, yeah, broad scope that can sometimes be something entirely new, a new approach. I'll tell you, I'm interested in whether we can use certain approaches. For example, Jacques Lacan, the French theorist. What does Lacan offer us when we think about Judaism? What can he offer us when we think about relations between Judaism and Christianity and Islam, for instance? So I think sometimes bringing theoretical dimensions can be very interesting. And I would encourage people to contribute with that in mind as well. In other words, sometimes someone goes to an archive and discovers some brand new material that no one's ever known about and publishes something that's radically new information. That's great. Sometimes people can take a well-known idea or text or published book and come up with a new way of thinking about it. And that's great too. The mixture is what makes the field exciting.
Okay, Professor Heschel, any answer you have without my question, or can you tell us something that I forget to ask you, maybe?
I don't know. I would say what's important to me is that we keep in mind that scholarship is an art. We are not a judge and a jury in a courtroom. And one of the things that disturbs me is that so many scholars act as if they are a jury in a courtroom, making a pronouncement. Is this genocide? Is that genocide, for example? No. Scholarship is an art that involves subtlety, careful distinctions, and that also can have a little of this and a little of that. It's in fact subtlety that makes scholarship interesting, that something is both this and that. I can tell you when Abraham Geiger writes that Jesus was a Pharisee and the Pharisees were the liberalizers. And he said, whatever the Pharisees said, same thing. Okay, that's fine. But I can also see somebody writing many, many years later that Geiger is describing the Pharisees after the image that liberal Protestants had of Jesus. So Jesus is like a Pharisee, but the Pharisees are like Jesus. So who is mirroring whom in this comparison? So there's sometimes things that we can see from a distance. We can see perhaps flaws in scholarship. Gershom Scholem said it was ein Schrei ins Leere, that the Jewish scholars of the Wissenschaft des Judentums of the 19th century were writing, but nobody was listening. Well, what I found in my research was that, in fact, they were listening. The Christian scholars were paying attention and writing about Geiger and Gretz and Yost and so many others. In those days, when I worked on this, the journals were in hard copy in the basement of the library. Nothing was digitized, and I had to take each volume from the 1860s and 1870s and go through page after page looking for the references and for the book review, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's much easier to do this kind of work, but yeah, I'm just saying. At any rate, it's a lot of work to be a scholar. It's hard work. But I also want to see that it is an art, that I'm not here to pass judgment. I'm here to show things being a little bit, let's say, eluding the kind of verdict that a jury comes up with. But on the contrary, actually a little of this and a little of that. It's the complexity. It's sometimes both and rather than this is the judgment. So I hope very much that we as scholars can retain that sense that our work is an art.
Professor Heschel, thank you for this wonderful interview.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be with you, and I thank you for your many wonderful questions.
You're welcome.